European Information Service. In your book Capital and Language, 2002, you state that the crisis is the moment in which historical memory, i.e. memories of crises of the past, resurface powerfully. What role might images of memory have today in the economic analysis of the current crisis? Every crisis should also be considered as a device that brings revelation, in some ways a technology of truth that exposes all that was being accumulated during the previous phase, the contradictions that accompany the process of development of events. Considered from this perspective, a crisis is also a moment when memory stamps itself on oblivion, because forgetfulness, thoughtlessness and irresponsibility prevail during the growth phase, whereas historical memory becomes a characteristic of moments of crisis. Crises are always, somewhat, Nietzscheanically, the eternal return of the equal and the different. Of the equal because they always represent a moment of deflagration, of impoverishment and dismay. Therefore, as such they repeat themselves through history, but at the same time they differ from one another because they are the outcome of processes of accumulation, production, and economic and social growth that vary from one period to another. Compared to the crisis of 2007, the current coronavirus crisis is very different, as the 2007 one was above all linked to the banking system. Of course, the 2007 crisis also affected the financial world, but those that suffered were first and foremost the banks, which had accumulated toxic securities that encouraged a huge expansion, especially in the United States, of the real estate sector, for example, by means of subprime mortgages. In contrast, the pandemic crisis has erupted on both the demand side, with the interruption to production and a linear reduction in incomes, and, at the same time, on the supply side with regard to production. These two instances are having, or have already had, a very heavy impact, which is far from being overcome in the next months. It will then be crucial for us to clearly understand the depth of this crisis in the real economy, by which I mean how many of those who have been pushed to the margins of the economy, for example with forms of reduced work or layoff, will return to work or not. In the meantime, processes of rationalization and digitization are already underway to increase work productivity, in order to reach the point of recovery ahead of the competition, a process that is having very problematic effects on employment, which is probably one of the most dramatic social aspects of the whole affair. With regard to the oppositional value inherent in the play on words, depth, how can we apply the category of depth, which is unrelated to the graphic standards of representation of economic trends, with respect to new forms of capitalism and their capillary development that affects the corporal dimension of people? Analysis of the ultra-expansionary monetary policies of the pandemic crisis shows that we are confronted by the dilemma posed by Nietzsche in his Genealogy of Morals, 1887, concerning the origin of money, or rather of debt, which is how money comes into circulation. When Nietzsche explains the origin of guilt, he uses the German word Schuld, which means both guilt and debt, to illustrate the very close connection between the two concepts. This endless emanation of liquidity is perhaps an opportunity to redefine the concept of debt, and free it from the idea of guilt. In the financial markets, the term moral hazard is used when an individual, unaffected by the possible negative economic consequences of a risk, behaves differently than if he were to withstand them. However, this questioning of the link between debt and guilt is rendered more difficult by the widespread idea that an individual who does not earn money is at fault, since this logic is pervasive and difficult to eradicate. The surface has been one of the key metaphors of Post-Fordism. Even the most recent European philosophical tradition has considered crossing at surface level to be an alternative mode of being deep, but in many cases, through a process of vulgarization, the idea of surface has produced a series of disvalues, making opportunism, cynicism and fear into actual professional skills. Opportunistic individuals manage to have a more immediate relationship with opportunity, regardless of the price to be paid in ethical terms, whereas cynics move indifferently from one system of rules to another, beyond the constraints imposed by a moral aspect. In both cases, these dynamics can be described in terms of a surface-level crossing that does not admit obstacles that exist inherently in the dimension of depth. The third disvalue, fear, is that emotional tone that allows elements to be held together that would otherwise be incompatible, such as the negation of the values of solidarity and effectiveness in the workplace. On the contrary, depth implies a reference to the body of the individual, thanks especially to the centrality in this crisis of a virus that directly attacks it, penetrating the body and causing an introspective mindset. It thus becomes crucial to reconfigure the rules of the interaction between bodies, highlighting the problem of redefining the idea of a collective body in our current situation, as well as its possibility. There is nothing deeper than one's own body, whose perversions determine its behaviors, and the virus exemplifies a global collective behavior that has stressed the environment, because our behavior, when analyzed in depth, is sick.